Welcome to the OMG Tarot podcast. I'm your host, Lindsay, aka OMG Tarot. This week, we're following up our Empress episode with the Emperor. The Emperor is number 4 in the Major Arcana. He comes right after number 3, the Empress, and right before number 5, the Hierophant. If the Empress is the mother archetype, the Emperor is the father archetype. That means that in the traditional sense, he's the provider for this family. He's the leader of their home, and he's the one who's charged with taking care of everyone who follows him. That means deciding what's right for his family and what's in his family's best interest. And that's really where we get to who the Emperor is as a tarot card. The Emperor is a leader, and he's a decider, and think of him like the general in an army. Although you might read him as domineering, I don't think that's an inherent part of the Emperor. And I think that calling the Emperor the father archetype and then assigning all these traits such as the leader and the provider and the decider can sometimes have a modern reader be like, wait, that's really regressive. And, well, yeah. Gender roles and expectations have changed in the centuries since we've begun playing with tarot cards. I think no matter what, a father's role is to provide for his family. And if the idea of him being an authoritarian and the leader and decision maker for his family doesn't really mesh with your idea of a father, recast him as a general in a military, because ultimately what we're dealing with is very projective, very focused, very driven energy here. So whether you want to cast him as a very motivated dad, like the kind who's going to argue with the kid's soccer coach, or more of an authoritarian boss figure, like the manager who tells his entire team exactly what he expects of them, it's more important that you understand the archetype that we're dealing with. The Emperor is Aries. That's pure rammy Aries energy, who's the starter and the driver and the one who sets his goal in the crosshairs and then fires. So let's take a closer look at the imagery we see in Pamela Coleman Smith's depiction of the Emperor. And I say this acknowledging that the Rider-Waite-Smith is not the only Emperor, but it's also the Emperor, and simply the deck, that most modern readers are perhaps most familiar with, whether you're reading with a Rider-Waite-Smith deck or a very similar one like the Universal Waite, or a deck that took a lot of its imagery inspiration from the Rider-Waite-Smith. But when you look back at older decks, like any Marseille-style deck or things like the Worth Tarot, you see some very different ideas, and it's really interesting to me, at least, how these different archetypes were depicted before Pamela Coleman Smith essentially set the modern template for them. And in Season 2 of this podcast, that's something that I plan on exploring a whole lot more. Because if you've been with me for a while, you've undoubtedly gotten used to the weekly deep dives into Major Arcana cards, and you undoubtedly know that we are getting close to the end. We've only got a handful left, and then what happens? Don't worry, this podcast is not going to end once we finish the Major Arcana. Expect more episodes like the interview ones, and more episodes about the craft of reading tarot, kind of like last week's The Reader Horror Stories. As far as a timeline goes, we are on track to finish the Major Arcana by the end of this calendar year, with another bonus or two thrown in there, so stay tuned every Thursday. But then what? OMG needs a break, and currently the plan is to take a short break at the beginning of 2025, and then come back at it in probably mid-January with Season 2. I'm excited, I've got some really cool things queued up for you guys, and I think it's going to be good. I also think I need to do something about the soundproofing in this room because, hey, better sound quality makes a better podcast. So stay tuned for that as well. So alright, getting back to the Emperor, we're looking at a guy with a long white beard, not unlike Santa Claus, and he's sitting on a solid stone throne. He's dressed in a lot of red, and as you can see underneath his red robes, he's wearing what appears to be a suit of armor. Up on his head, he's wearing a crown that's got inlaid white and red jewels, and then over in his hands, we see an orb in his left hand and a scepter that looks a lot like an ankh in his right hand. Zooming out a bit more, when we look at his throne, we see it's adorned with ram's heads. And as we've mentioned a little bit earlier, he's Aries energy. So keep in mind everything you know about Aries. They're a cardinal sign, so they're a starter. They're a fire sign, so they're driven and motivated and passionate. And just for some extra fiery oomph, it's the first sign of the zodiac, so think very visionary and leader, and the one who kicks things off and gets the party started. In the background, we see some craggly faced mountains, and down below, we see a little itty bitty stream flowing behind him. These craggly faced mountains have been described as a Martian landscape, and it tracks with what this card is all about because Mars is the ruling planet of Aries, so there is a lot of that driven, bellicose Martian energy here in this card. The Martian imagery is also often pointed to as the counterpart to the Empress's Venus, while she's actually pretty clearly on Earth because, to my knowledge, Venus doesn't have fields of wheat or trees that look very similar to Earth trees. She is associated with the planet Venus and all that it symbolizes, such as beauty and love and aesthetics. So we often see these two paired as the Venus and Mars together and how they counterbalance each other and also work together and support each other. In fact, I think it can be very helpful to think about the Empress and the Emperor as a couple and think about how both halves of this couple bring something unique and complementary to the table. They are essentially the parents of the Fool's Journey, and while the Empress nurtures you and lifts you up and gives you a solid foundation to launch yourself from, the Emperor helps you direct your energy and show you exactly, now that you've been lifted and supported, where do you go from here? How are you going to launch yourself toward what comes next? We see allusions to this pairing of the Emperor and the Empress in a lot of the symbols that are on the Emperor card. Notably, take a look at what's in his hands. In his left hand, his receiving hand, we have that golden orb. It's sometimes referred to as a golden apple, and it's symbolic of fertility and life. The golden apple is often a symbol associated with Venus, and with the golden apple over here in the Emperor's left hand, we can see how he's receiving that love and that life and all of those nourishing things from her. And then what is he projecting outward? That Ankh, more life, virility. He needs the Empress's grounded support in order to be his projective, strong, let's go get it self. This actually isn't the first time you've encountered this dynamic in the major arcana. Think back to the lovers and what's on each lover's tree. We've got the woman with her vibrant fruiting tree and the man with his tree that's on fire. We once again see this joining of the two energies, the projective and the grounded, coming together to propel the Fool on his journey. Keep in mind that both the Empress and the Emperor come before the lovers in the major arcana. So if we're looking at it linearly, the Fool meets first the Empress, then the Emperor, and then a couple steps down the line reaches the lovers. So perhaps we can interpret this as the Fool first needs to learn these lessons of grounding and nurturing from the Empress, and then take some direction and learn how to project himself from the Emperor, and then finally be in a position to make critical choices about who he partners with. Shifting our attention back to the Emperor, let's focus on another one of the symbols here, his suit of armor. This guy is protected as he goes into battle. While he primarily plays offense, he's got a solid defense here too. He's got a impenetrable barrier between his body and any environment that he finds himself in. And let's talk a bit more about the environment that he tends to find himself in. Looking at those craggly rocks that we mentioned a bit earlier, he's got hurdles to overcome. He's got mountains that he's scaling up and taking on as a challenge. But he's not just firing indiscriminately at his target. Take a look at his feet. They're planted pretty firmly on the ground. He's not the first figure we've seen who has their feet planted firmly on the ground, and in fact, the Empress has that too. These people are all firmly rooted in what they're doing, and while the Empress is firmly rooted in her abundance and her creation, I'd say the Emperor is firmly rooted in his vision of what comes next and his strategy. While that requires a lot of passion and ambition, it does inevitably involve some emotion, and that's what we see in that little tiny stream that's running right along the base of the mountains. We can interpret this very small, looking pretty calm stream as indication that emotionally he's quite collected. He's not someone who's dealing with a lot of tumultuous waves and emotions the way some other figures in the deck are. But he's not made of stone, and he's not heartless. And I think that's important to keep in mind when you interpret the Emperor. To do one more comparison with the Empress, because again, I really think it's important to compare and contrast these two because they're so intricately tied up in the story of the Major Arcana. Take a look at her stream. It's got a whole lot more lines on it, and it's got the white mixed in with the blue, indicating a lot more movement. Hers is a lot more fluid, and it's got a waterfall. We can interpret this as she's pouring all of that energy and that fuel for life into what she's cultivating, versus for him, it's a lot more contained and it's a lot more constrained. And he's not giving that emotional nurturing and support. He's only just kind of relying on the bit of water that's already coursing through him. So, all in all, the Emperor is direct. He's a strategizer and a visionary, and he's someone who will get things started and get them done. Let's drop the Emperor into the Major Arcana. We already talked a bit about the Empress, the card who precedes him, so I don't want to rehash her too much. We know she's grounded, and we know she provides support and all of the material nurturing that one might need before they can project their will and determination onto the challenges they face. Then we have the Emperor, which this whole episode's about him, so we're gonna skip over him for now and shift our focus over to number 5, the Hierophant. Now, the Hierophant has some similarities with the Emperor in that they're both leaders and they're both ones who set our fool up for making better decisions and directing himself as he moves through the major arcana. But here's the difference. The Emperor hits a lot closer to home. Again, think of the Emperor as dad. Dad lives in your house. Dad sees you every day. And I understand this is not the case for everybody, but ideally, you have daily interactions with both your parents. Think then the Hierophant is more like a teacher or a school official. You still see them as an authority figure, but you don't live with them. There's a bit of distance there. You see them when they're at school, or if you want to conceptualize the Hierophant as more of a coach or a government official or a religious leader, which we're actually going to talk a bit more about that in the Hierophants episode because that's really one of your key ways to conceptualize him. But in any case, none of those are your dad. Those are people who live and work in your community and you learn from and interact with, but they don't have the personalized vested interest in you that your parents have. So we could read the Hierophant as your first taste with your culture and your community after you've mastered the lessons that you learn at home from mom and dad. We'll expand more on this idea when we talk about the Hierophant in a few weeks. For now, let's take a look at a few example polls that feature the Emperor. In this one, I'm going to use the Emperor as a significator. A significator is a tarot card that you deliberately pull out of the deck to symbolize a certain person or situation that you're doing a reading about. When you do that, you're kind of taking that card out of play because now that it's no longer in the deck, it can't come up randomly after you've shuffled. And what you're also doing is setting a very intentional tone for your tarot card reading. I don't use significators very often. In fact, there's only a handful of cases where I really do tend to use them, and one of them is a relationship spread that I really like to do. In fact, now that I've mentioned it, I think I'll share that relationship spread in the next edition of the newsletter, so if you're not on my mailing list yet, get on it, because that's how you get OMG Tarot spreads and news and such all delivered to your inbox. It's also so easy. Literally, just go to omgtarot.com and sign up there. I promise I'm not going to spam your inbox. Alrighty, so since we're dealing with Emperor energy here, let's do a spread on what do I need to know about my current relationship with my father. So we set our Emperor aside as our significator, and I'm going to pull 3 cards to actually tell the story here. So we're pulling a total of 4 cards, our Emperor, and then underneath I'm putting the 3 cards that I shuffle and pull up. And I've pulled the 5 of Swords, the Devil, and the 6 of Pentacles. So I don't know what your deal is, rhetorical querent, but the 5 of Swords is telling me that you feel like you kind of have the upper hand with regard to some information or understanding in this relationship, and that you're committed to keeping that upper hand, because the devil is obsessions, and it's the things that really draw you in and keep you chained up to the idea, even if it's not actually productive or good for you. And I think that this sense of being really tied up and latching onto this bit of information that you have, or even just a more general, broader understanding it, in any case, this largely has to do with thoughts and mind stuff. You're not really being very fair to him or to yourself. That's what I'm getting out of our 6 of Pentacles here, because that card has a lot to do with fairness and grounding for all parties involved, and the fact that you have it following up after the Devil and the 5 of Swords tells me that those two are kind of blocking this. So, alright, that was kind of a lot. And to illustrate the Emperor in more of a strategic planner role, let's do another pull where I'm going to pull 2 cards to answer the question, how can I best tap into my Emperor energy? And I got the Knight of Swords and the Queen of Cups, which I think is very interesting that I just pulled 2 court cards, and I'm going to interpret this as these are 2 different roles that I need to lean into in order to tap into my Emperor energy. It's always important to make sure that you're reading your cards in the context of the question that you asked, if you asked a question. So in terms of how can I best tap into my Emperor energy? Well, first I see the Knight of Swords, which is the knight of thoughts and logic and strategy, so that kind of tracks. And interestingly, he's a knight, which means that he's got that teenager, fresh faced, making breakthroughs kind of energy. So this guy is not only using his brain, he's using his brain in new and expansive and innovative ways. So I would firstly interpret this card as, in order to tap into my Emperor energy, I need to think nimbly and think with this perspective of making mental breakthroughs and having epiphanies. I need to not only be ready for new understanding, but actively seek it out. So I need to seek out ways and opportunities to expand my mind. All the while, as the Queen of Cups, I need to be open and receptive to others' emotions as I'm doing that Knight of Swords stuff. So while I'm seeking out new understandings, a key part of that understanding is, how do people feel at a deeper level? What are they really thinking about and feeling their way through, and where are their emotions going? I need to be open and empathetic. And I think that makes a lot of sense for an emperor figure, because as I strategize and essentially lead my troops into battle, I need to be on the forefront of understanding things, and I need to be aware of where they're at and what they're feeling. So I'm reading this as, for you, your emperor is more of an empathetic leader and not a dictator. Which, good. I think they tend to make better leaders anyway. And that's about it for our discussion of the Emperor this week. I hope you enjoyed, and if you enjoyed, please leave me a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. It really does help. I know I've heard that a million times over the years from all the podcasts I listen to, and then now here I am saying it too. And, well, because it does really help. And if you didn't enjoy this podcast, then don't. It's been fun hanging out with you guys, and as always, I'm just a DM or email away. You can find me on Instagram at its underscore OMG underscore tarot, or at my website, which is omgtarot.com. That's where you have to go to sign up to get on my newsletter, so if that's something you have any interest in whatsoever, go do that. And beyond that, we'll talk soon. Bye bye.